I'm the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm really happy to be able to kick off this event to celebrate Luciano's latest publishing triumph. We're a multidisciplinary department of the university, spanning right across the 4 divisions of the university. And last summer, we held an away day, partly to talk about sort of what expertise we were lacking, what we were really lacking to sort of build multidisciplinary research teams for new projects, etc. And there was almost universal consensus that what we needed was somebody with expertise in philosophy and ethics of information and the internet. So that's what we decided to do, and I think everybody had in mind that we might be able to get some researcher with a focus in that area. So it surpassed our wildest dreams when we when we were able to welcome Professor Luciano Floridi to the department, the founding father of the philosophy of information, the foremost authority on the ethics of the internet. So I think that really went way beyond what everybody was thinking. It was very nice for me because it made it look like your wish is my command. But seriously, you know, we couldn't be happier to welcome Luciano to the OII. We're really happy that you're here. We hope that you'll be really happy here, and I think we think it's the perfect place for you. I hope that's the conclusion you come to too. So tonight, Luciano is introducing his new book, as I said, Ethics of Information. That's part of as I understand it, a multi-decade plan, the second in the series following the philosophy of information in 2011. As well as being a leading world-class academic with an H score to die for, Luciano is also a brilliant speaker, as you will all know or are about to find out. He's going to talk about the gardener, the dentist, and the long jumper. Only Luciano could deliver this speech, so you're in a sort of unique situation now to be able to hear someone who can make a linkage between those 3 things and the ethics of information. So I will hand over to Luciano after we've finished, after Luciano has delivered his lecture and we've had some questions. We'd like to invite you all for drinks here at the Institute. So thank you very much, and handing over to you.
Thank you so much. I was already worried about giving this talk before this presentation. Now I'm terrified. The reason being that chances of doing this badly are enormous. I would like you to read the book. If I tell you too much, you're not going to read it. If I tell you the wrong things, you're not going to read it. And if I leave you insufficiently curious, you're not going to read it. So somehow I need to find a way of telling you enough, but without telling you too much and telling you the right thing. So I thought that the 3 analogies would help. I will tell you what happens before the book, so that you will be left with a pinch of curiosity sufficient to make the philosophy editor Peter Momchilov happy afterwards. I understand that Peter might actually say a few words very quickly at the end of my lecture, if that's all right. Let me walk you through the lecture, which I'm planning to keep brief. You know the difference between planning and actually delivering. But this is the map. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the 3 analogies so you understand why I'm using them. And then some old-fashioned analysis of what we normally understand by ethical questions. That will help me to tell you more about the background which lies behind the book and why the book is trying to upgrade that general framework. So point number 3 will be an introduction to the old ethical framework with which we normally deal still nowadays. And point number 4 will be how we can upgrade that old framework and in what direction. 5 will attempt to explain the very essence of the book in one slide. And the conclusion will wrap up the lecture. Now, let me start with the premise. The gardener. Well, the gardener is there to remind us where philosophy happens. Philosophy cares so much about what happens up the tree that looks at the roots. Is not going to prune the branches, is not going to look at the beautiful flowers, but that care is exercised by looking underground. So if it is obscure, literally, well, that's because we're working under the surface. And if people tend to disagree, well, try to work under the surface yourself, and you see that sometimes you bump into each other and so on. So the gardener is there to remind us where this talk is taking place. The dentist is a painful reminder of when philosophy happens, always at the last moment, because you try to resist going to the dentist or doing philosophy for as long as it takes, and then sooner or later you know it's time to do it, you know it's time to go. So the dentist, which, trust me, my wife is there, I'm terrified by it, is there to tell us maybe, for once, having seen the future, maybe we could do philosophy a bit earlier. One of those 6 months check that avoids more painful things coming anyway in the future. But the metaphor I want to keep running for the next half an hour or so is the next. Is not the where, is not the when, is the how. You ask a philosopher to deal with a particular problem, and you put the problem in front of the philosopher. The next thing that the philosopher does is to walk in the opposite direction. You hear many people, especially politicians, shouting at you in Brussels. It's like, where are you going? That is the problem. We want a solution now for that problem. Say, exactly. That's a big problem. And therefore, the run-up will have to be longer. The wider the gap, the bigger the problem, the more steps you need to take in order to jump forward. So basically, this half an hour is the run-up. I'm not going to tell you how am I going to jump, because that is in the book. But if you want to see how I'm going to jump forward and whether I land without breaking my legs, well, read the book. If you want to see exactly how we're going to get there until the very moment when you are up in the air, and then Peter will say a few words, then that's the task of the next slides. Now, the gentleman there is going to tell us a few important things. Is Mike Powell. On August 30, 1991, he set the current men's world record at the World Championship in Tokyo. Is almost 9 meters. Quite impressive, but even more impressive for us today are the suggestions he's going to make in the following slides. So that's the where, the when, and the how. Let's try to do some philosophy. Even outside academia, you find these questions being asked. The colleague who has a problem at work, the friend who may or may not want to divorce children involved, the young teenager who asks, well, what kind of job, etc. So the question that we normally ask in ethics are 3. Who should I be? What should I do? And why should I do it? Now, they are there in logical order, not in chronological order. Normally, the older you get, the more you find B pressing. You assume that, well, you are what you are, and you don't care so much why you should do it, as in sort of the reluctant undergraduate who says, but why shouldn't I kill everybody? You know, give me a reason. What's the justification? So, and he's like, you know, I'm just a good guy. I really want to do the right thing. What's the right thing to do in these circumstances? That you will find, I'm looking at a few young people here, the most pressing, disturbing, annoying question in the sort of long life you have ahead. It's what is the right thing to do in those circumstances that normally bothers us. So a bit of a technical terminology. The first one is self-poietic, is about making oneself. The second one is the substantive, is the one that remains with us possibly until the very last day. And C is the motivational, not necessarily carrot and stick, but generally speaking, reasoning and justifications. Now, with this in the background, you can tell I'm assuming that you have done no ethics whatsoever. Where is the muscle, the power, the engine in ethical questions? Is in that powerful should. Should gives you the prop to jump forward. So that's normally what we mean by the normative strength of some questions. The direction of the jump, if you allow me to rely on that analogy a bit longer, is in the W question. The who, the what, the why, so that with that engine behind you, you will jump in one direction, who I am, what should I do, or why should I do it, throughout your life. Now, in this context, normally, what happens is that there is a source of answers. And for a long time, that source was divine. Divine as in God/gods, more God on this side of the universe. It does mean that we can get a general framework behind those questions. I'm not talking, I need your attention here, I'm not talking about specific answers to those questions. I'm talking about the sort of framework that having that source as a potential resource for your answers sets up. It's like saying, well, whatever the answers to these questions are, this is the game we're playing. And the game we're playing is a judgment and punishment, praise and blame kind of game. That's what ethics starts sounding like. It's about, well, ultimately, everybody being judged. No matter what you did, no matter how good or bad you were, you will judge anyway. So if you are judged anyway, well, the whole ethical game starts being framed within a judgment and punishment, which I will try to convince you is not necessarily the only way of doing it. Second, precisely because the ethical game at large is about praise and blame, judging, being evaluated, it has to be, surely, a fair game. How awful would it be if we were going to be judged and unfair rules? No, head, you win, tail, you lose. That's the kind of thing that you expect. If anyone is playing tricks, then the intelligibility, the fair rules and trials, they go out of the window. Intelligibility here means that you do not expect ethics to be like quantum physics or neuroscience. It's something that anyone can do, as many other things that cannot be mentioned in this context count. So anyone can do ethics because, of course, anyone is going to be judged according to fair rules, and that's the game. Surprisingly, you can divide more, in our sort of conventional way of understanding Middle Age, more medieval context from the modernity by judging whether it's ethics that is going to be grounded in some kind of divine law or vice versa. If you pick up a country and in the country ethics is grounded on something more fundamental, the law given by some divine principles, then you know that in this side, on this side of Europe, we would consider that rather medieval, not judgment pass, just in terms of stage of development in the history of ethics. And of course is theocentric. Now this is another important point. The emphasis is on centric, not on theo. In other words, it means that whatever the game is, humanity, we are not at the center of the game. There's a divinity, there's some kind of text, there's something else that is at the center. We work around it. We are going to be judged, and whatever judgments we pass are not up to us to be questioned ultimately. So this is the sort of old framework that we have inherited from the past. A lot of things have changed. The source has disappeared, at least academically speaking, not necessarily down the road, and certainly not in many countries. But that piece of the puzzle has no longer been with us for some time. We're talking 17th century onwards, so it's been a while. So, of course, we do not expect ethics being grounded on any kind of law, divine or not, is, of course, no longer a theocentric ethics. So what's the difference? What has replaced that? Mind that we have inherited from the past 1 and 2. I hope you appreciate the sort of strange paradox that after the Greeks, in a sort of Christian context, we still frame ethics largely in terms of judgment and punishment, fair rules and trial, intelligibility, even if that intelligibility, for example, is not guaranteed by anybody. So what we have replaced is, in terms of potential source for answers to those questions, is humanity. And by having humanity asking questions and humanity answering questions, then we have replaced 3 and 4. 3 and 4 now have shifted in modernity. It's ethics that grounds law, not vice versa. Or as you find there, law is grounded in ethics. When law has anything to do with ethics, of course, there is a lot of conventional points about where you drive, left or right, but that is not ethical. And of course, we have replaced the theocentric with the anthropocentric. Now, that is, again, the emphasis is on centric. We are now not only at the center of the game because we're asking the questions, we are at the center of the game because we're also providing the answers, and the justifications of the answers is very humanistic in a sort of modern sense. So what we have seen so far is the old framework and how that old framework in modernity has been challenged. A few things went and a few things were kept. It's a mixed bag, and we don't have time, luckily, but there's plenty to be said about this in terms of how these components do or do not fit together. While we were thinking about whether they did, whether they didn't, well, something else has happened. The revolution that is under our eyes, the information revolution, ICTs, this very institute, has happened. And that has given an extra push to that framework. So the framework was already almost not quite making it. We were still working on how we could fix it. A patch here, maybe a little bang there, when we actually got hit again by something rather extraordinary. Not only religion has moved out of the ethical discourse, information technology has come in the ethical discourse. So a major component has disappeared, and a major component has come in. This shifting of roles within the ethical discourse has caused further disruptions. There's more to be analyzed and understood. And it's here that Michael Powell becomes, once again, quite helpful. This is an interview that Michael Powell gave some time ago about how do you do it? I mean, how can you jump so far? This is when you understand that the gentleman in question not only has fantastic legs, but a very deep brain. I read it for those of you too far away. It should be an American accent. The thing that I try to tell coaches, get your athletes to think of the long jump as a vertical jump. That's very counterintuitive. It's really not a horizontal jump. The distance comes from the speed. So in order to be successful, you have to think the unthinkable. You have to think that not only in order to jump forward, you have to move backwards, but in order to jump forward very far, you have to jump high. So basically you move backwards and jump high in order to go very forward and successfully. Now that's the exercise I would like you to sort of indulge me in, so that we can think the not clearly intuitive, not the easily thinkable, because the unthinkable is already happening under our eyes, and we need more conceptually to cope with what is hitting us. So I like to invite you to consider any moral action, killing and stealing, or just not telling the truth, as a matter of two simple elements, an agent and a patient, understood as a sender and a receiver of a message. Surely you must be, surely morality is much more, surely you don't mean to run backwards and jump high in order to jump forward, and surely I do. So we need to consider for a moment, at least for the next 15 minutes or so, that all there is in a moral action is, simplifying to the most, it's an agent, a patient, and an interaction between the two, which we consider just one way to simplify our life, as a message passing. Is someone sending a message to someone else. Killing is just an act of communication. Stretching it, I know, but we need to jump forward. So, in this context, how can we revise that old framework? Well, first of all, remember, number one, judgment and punishment. And now I'm talking on the side of the agent sender. If you have, imagine, in a house, kids, wife, husband, if all there is in terms of ethical discourse is judgment and punishment, all there is responsibility. That becomes the base, the ground for any other ethical analysis. Now, unfortunately, responsibility, as you can read on the slide, means that by constraining the ethical discourse around responsibility, we become unable to conceive any other agent in the world. Because, of course, this microphone cannot be responsible. Of course, this computer cannot be responsible. Of course, an app cannot be responsible. Nor a dog, nor a company, unless by what you mean by responsibility is just identifying the human individuals in that company who are really responsible, but not the company as a multi-agent system, not a piece of software. You look for the engineer, not for the system, not for the nation state. Now that I would recommend you to consider is only partially true. We need to be able to think in terms of non-responsibility based ethics. So we can replace judgment and punishment, and therefore the responsibility business, with something else. More on this in a moment. The other bit that we could consider in terms of replacing is the anthropocentric element. If all we can deal with are humans versus humans, well, there is certainly no environmentalism. I mean, you can't take care of either the dog, the environment, the green valley, but you cannot take care of human resources. You can't take care of a whole city, of a system, of a database, because of course those are not humans, or only indirectly, only insofar as humans are involved. So here, what is actually constraining is the concept of moral worth. You think that basically the ethical game is a game for humans only, as agents and patients. That's the Kantian view. Either you send or receive a message, but no, whatever ball you're passing around, the receiver and the sender are all human in the first place. Well, let's try to consider that as a possible constraint, and let's try to drop it. What kind of picture do we get? Well, first of all, remember, now the approach is humanity plays the game of asking the questions and giving the answers for the allegedly, hopefully, right reasons. But the 4 points are transformed in the following way. You move from responsibility to accountability. Now, accountability doesn't require mind, doesn't require intentions, it doesn't require a plan. But you can tell that the dog is accountable for making a mess in the house, and that particular system was accountable for. So basically, you trace back the causal chain to that particular element. Now, if you want to know more, that's the time to start looking at the book. But that is one first attempt that we can do in terms of reshaping the framework. Now, the second point about intelligibility, well, I think, unfortunately, we can go back to the Greeks. If at any time of humanity, we perfectly understand what it means to have the information about what's going to happen and no power to act accordingly. Now, that is just the definition of the tragic. You have the information, you know what ought to be done, and you can't do it. You just see it happening under your eyes. You suffer because you have goodwill. In a Kantian-ish sense. And the tragic is there to remind us that sometimes ethics is not an intelligible and fair game. It doesn't have to be, unfortunately. We also realize that the relationship between ethics and law is way more complex in terms of grounding. There's a lot, of course, in contemporary ethical analysis that tells us about how the legislation, the rules of the game shape the ethical behavior, and of course the ethical requirements can shape the rules. So who grounds what becomes a little bit more complicated. I write there, just for you to remember, the possibility, for example, having a pro-ethical design of rules something that is a variation of nudging, so popular in the United States, or ethics by design. What is ethics by design if not providing the right rules and settings so that ethical behavior becomes more feasible? And of course, a concept which I like to label infra-ethics, the sort of infrastructure that makes ethical behavior easier, more feasible, that invites certain kind of actions rather than others. Now, all these are messy, trans-border issues that we find way more closer to our problems today when it comes to law versus ethics. And finally, I would like to go back, well, not necessarily to a theocentric perspective, I'm not that insane, but to a middle ground. It's not about God being at the center of the ethical discourse, it's not us being at the center of the ethical discourse, it's actually the world being at the center of the ethical discourse. And since this is not intuitive, Michael Powell will come again to give us a hand. And this is the continuation of his interview. When asked what's the most important thing about the jump, he says the approach. For those of you, again, too far away, I believe that the approach is 90% of the jump. Once you leave the ground, this whole distance that you can go is already predetermined. So really, old framework, new framework, how we got the new framework halfway through, how God came out, ICT came in, we are reshaping the oldish framework in new ways, but from what perspective? What is the right way of getting into that? How can we jump properly and achieve what we want to do? To do that, we need to change the approach. And the approach that I have taken for granted is the following. Remember, the ultimate source of answers is humanity. In that little scheme between the sender and the receiver, the agent and the patient, and the message in between, the questions are always asked by the I. And for the philosophers among us, that is the I of Descartes, is the transcendental self of Kant. It's us, as humanity, putting ourselves in charge and saying, we ask the questions, and, well, we will struggle with the answers. But we are the ones. We want to deal with this game from an agent-oriented perspective. We've done this all the time. We used to do that in Greece. Virtue ethics is about who should I be. It's what Kant does. It's what Mill does. It's about me. So the normative approach, remember Mike Powell, is agent-oriented. In the book, you find a sustained effort to shift that from an agent-oriented to a patient-oriented perspective. If the ultimate source of our information is the world, then maybe it is time to put the world at the center of our concerns. Let me give you a small example that we encountered literally last week when we were with a colleague who's here in Rome for the NATO Cyber War and Ethics Conference. One of the problems that NATO has is the definition of an object. What is an object worth considering as a target? And the kind of definition that they have is very Newtonian. It's very, as it were, old framework. It has to be something that you can see or touch, and then they move forward. Now, unfortunately, databases are not something you can see or touch. And yet, in cyber war, there are all networks, so they have a problem there. One suggestion I made was, well, maybe what we should consider here is place the target at the center of your concern and consider that something that can interact with you. If it can interact with you, that is a potential target. And that could be a network, a database, or an object in the old Newtonian idea. It was well received, not least because now they can target almost anything. So I didn't see that kind of corner when I made my suggestions. Now you know that if they target your mobile, it's my fault. But back to the original point. If you have a patient-oriented, then all of a sudden the kind of ethics that we are doing here at the OII is in line with environmental ethics, with medical ethics, with bioethics. These are all new ways recently discuss. No, philosophy is an old discipline, so just a few decades is yesterday, where you put the patient, the recipient of the action, at the center, and is the agent that receives from the patient instructions on how to behave. We have been there before. I thought I had discovered something fundamental. More on that in the book. But because this concept is a bit complicated to convey, I thought that a reference to something that we are all very well acquainted with will go down well. And I'm coming to the end of my talk. I thought that basically the idea of this shift from a agent-oriented to a patient-oriented perspective could be better conveyed by one of the most famous slogans in advertisement. Because I'm worth it. It's a long time. It's been since 1971 that we have been used to read that almost anywhere. Paradoxically, it was meant to be a sort of statement of empowerment and self-confidence. Women, we're talking about 1971. To someone my age, that sounds a little bit less empowering and self-confidence giving. But the whole idea here is agent-oriented. Is the very view that because I'm worth it as an agent, then the rest of the ethical discourse will run around my request, which might be a request for information, it might be actually questions, but I'm the one who is issuing the questions in the first place. And that's why it's important to remember that since 2002, even L'Oreal has realized that you have to switch perspective. It's because you are worth it. And that is the trick that basically in the book plays a central role. The shift from the patient perspective, so that it's the patient that is telling us what needs to be done rather than vice versa. Now I know that I've done about 27 minutes and my time is running out, so I wanted to conclude with something a little bit less light. The next is a citation from, which starts at the beginning, which opens chapter 2. It is my last attempt to convince you that what I'm saying in the book is not entirely bananas. It comes from Martin Luther King, and again, for those of you too far away, it's a citation from Rediscovering Lost Values. If we're going to go too forward, we must go back, like Powell, and rediscover these precious values, that all reality, not just us, not just animals, not just trees, all reality hinges on moral foundations, and that all reality, twice, has spiritual control. Put that at the center of your life, and you know that the jump might actually be successful. Thank you so much.